You know, when my daughter first approached me with her wedding plans, I genuinely wanted to be supportive. She's my only daughter, and I've always dreamed of seeing her walk down the aisle, radiant and happy. But as she laid out her vision, the designer gowns, the imported flowers, the 5-tier cake flown in from Paris, and a live band that charged more than most people's yearly salary, I felt a knot form in my stomach. It wasn't that I didn't want to contribute, of course I did. I had always planned on helping with her wedding. But what she was proposing wasn't just a celebration of love. It was a spectacle meant to dazzle and impress, a performance with a ticket price that could fund someone's college education or put a hefty down payment on a home. I tried to reason with her gently at first. I reminded her of how we'd always valued living within our means. I spoke of the importance of starting a marriage on stable financial ground, not chasing debts or obligations just to keep up appearances. I explained that while I was more than willing to give her a generous contribution, enough for a beautiful, heartfelt wedding, I couldn't in good conscience bankroll a lavish event that seemed more about showing off than honoring the love between her and her fiancé. I thought she would understand, or at least take a moment to reflect. Instead, she looked at me as if I'd shattered her entire world. It was heartbreaking. She accused me of being stingy, of not loving her enough to make her dreams come true. That cut deeper than I can properly express. As a parent, you spend decades sacrificing, putting your child first in ways both big and small, hoping they grow up to appreciate life's deeper values. In that moment, it seemed all those lessons had vanished. I had to remind myself that saying no wasn't an act of cruelty, it was an act of love. Because love doesn't always say yes. Sometimes love draws a line, for the sake of your child's long-term well-being, for the sake of family harmony, for the sake of your own financial security. Truth be told, I also had to consider my own future. Retirement isn't so far off, and I've worked hard to ensure I won't become a burden on my children later. It would make no sense to jeopardize that for a one-day event, no matter how beautiful. I've seen too many parents drain their savings, take on second mortgages, or rack up credit card debt just to give their kids the fairy tale wedding. Then years down the line, those same couples may be divorced, or the parents are left struggling. I wasn't going to let that be our story. So I stood firm. I told her I loved her dearly, that I would be thrilled to support a meaningful, joyful wedding within reason, but I wouldn't fund a luxury extravaganza that compromised our family's values and my financial stability. It wasn't an easy stance to take. In fact, it was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had. But I believe boundaries are one of the greatest gifts we can give our loved ones. Without them, we enable unrealistic expectations and set everyone up for disappointment down the road. Looking back, I know I made the right decision. It was never about denying her happiness. It was about protecting something bigger, her respect for money, her appreciation for genuine love over glittering distractions, and our family's long tradition of living wisely and gratefully. What I didn't quite anticipate was just how deeply my decision would wound her pride, or how dramatically she would react. In the days that followed our conversation, it was like I no longer recognized my own daughter. Her phone calls became clipped, her visits less frequent, and when we did speak, there was an unmistakable frost in her voice. I could hear it, that undercurrent of simmering resentment, as though she believed I had betrayed her in some profound, unforgivable way. It was as if in her eyes I had suddenly transformed from the loving, supportive parent who'd always stood by her side into some heartless obstacle standing in the way of her perfect day. I tried to reach out to reassure her of my love. I sent little texts, offered to take her out for coffee, hoping we could smooth things over and refocus on what truly mattered. her marriage the start of a life together with someone she loved. But each attempt seemed to be met with strained politeness or outright avoidance. It pained me more than I can say. You see, no matter how old your children get, there's still that instinct to wrap them up in your arms and fix everything, to shoulder their hurts and soothe their frustrations. But in this case, there was nothing to fix, at least, nothing I could fix without compromising my principles and teaching her all the wrong lessons. Then came the moment that truly laid bare just how far things had deteriorated. She invited me to a family dinner, or so I thought. I arrived, genuinely hopeful that this might be a chance for us to reconnect, to clear the air, and perhaps even find some common ground. But from the moment I walked through the door, I sensed something was off. The atmosphere was too bright, the smiles too forced. Seated around the table were her fiancé's parents, a couple of their family friends, and even her future in-law's pastor. It was a respectable gathering, people who didn't know me all that well, and people she clearly wanted to impress. When the conversation inevitably drifted to wedding plans, my daughter seized the moment. With a practiced sort of casualness, she recounted her disappointment at how some parents just aren't willing to prioritize their children's happiness, punctuating it with a little sigh that spoke volumes. The others shifted uncomfortably. A few offered sympathetic looks her way, murmuring how unfortunate it was. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, not from shame, but from the shock of realizing she had orchestrated this. An ambush designed to paint me as cold and miserly before a table of strangers. It stung in a way I can't quite capture. To see your child twist the truth, to watch her leverage your love, your honest attempt to guide and protect her, as a weapon against you. It's a heartbreak that runs deeper than most wounds. But more than that, it was sobering. It forced me to see that sometimes even those closest to us can lash out in ways we never imagined, driven by pride, hurt, or simply a desperate clinging to appearances. I sat there quietly, listening, letting her have her say, because in that moment I realized something important. My dignity didn't rest on the approval of that table. It rested on knowing I had acted out of love and responsibility. Still, it was a painful lesson. I had to accept that my daughter's disappointment had morphed into something sharper, something that sought validation through public sympathy, even at the cost of our bond. And that perhaps was the deepest cut of all. When I think back to that dinner, I can still feel the tightness in my chest, the way my pulse drummed steadily in my ears. I had walked in with hopeful intentions, wanting nothing more than to ease the tension between us. It seemed like a perfect opportunity. A pleasant evening surrounded by her future in-laws, a warm meal, perhaps even a toast to new beginnings. I truly believed that maybe, just maybe, we could bridge the awkward gap that had formed since our disagreement. But the reality of that night unfolded so differently, almost like a carefully staged play in which I was cast as the unwitting villain. From the start, there was an odd sort of energy around the table. Everyone smiled a bit too brightly, laughed a bit too quickly at jokes that weren't especially funny, and kept darting glances my way, as if waiting for something. My daughter was in rare form. She radiated charm, complimenting the hostess on her cooking, sharing little anecdotes that painted her as sweet and thoughtful. For a moment I even felt relieved, thinking perhaps she had moved past the bitterness. But deep down, there was a restlessness in her eyes that unsettled me. Then, as though on cue, someone asked about the wedding. It was an innocent question. How were the plans coming along? Did they have a date set? That's when she leaned forward, lowering her voice just enough to make the moment feel conspiratorial, intimate, as though she were sharing a sorrowful confession. She spoke about how the guest list had to be trimmed, how certain dreams had to be scaled back. Her hand fluttered to her chest, and she let out a delicate sigh before saying, "Of course. We had hoped for more, but unfortunately, not all parents are willing to make their children's happiness priority." The room fell into an awkward hush. Her future mother-in-law cleared her throat, offering a sympathetic murmur. Someone else nodded, visibly uncomfortable, but clearly moved by my daughter's apparent disappointment. And there I sat, feeling each of their silent judgments land on me like tiny stones. It was as if the entire table had been turned against me in an instant, without ever hearing my side of the story. I can't adequately describe what it feels like to be ambushed by your own child in a room full of strangers. It was humiliating, yes, but it was also profoundly saddening. I wanted to reach across the table and shake her, to remind her of all the birthdays, the scraped knees, the late-night study sessions, the sacrifices both big and small I had made simply to see her smile. All of that seemed to vanish in the glow of her carefully constructed narrative. But I didn't react. I didn't defend myself or protest that she was twisting the truth. Instead, I sat there quietly, hands folded in my lap, letting her have the floor. I knew instinctively that if I responded out of wounded pride, it would only validate her performance, deepen the spectacle. This was her stage, and I wasn't going to be maneuvered into dancing to her script. As I looked around the table at all these polite faces, people who barely knew me yet were now silently judging me, I felt something shift inside. I realized that this wasn't just about money, or a wedding, or even the dinner itself. This was about her learning what love really means, about understanding that it's not measured by grand gestures or luxury affairs, but by steady, often invisible acts of support and devotion. So I let the silence stretch, let her story hang there between us, and resolved in that moment to handle what came next with the kind of grace I hoped one day she would understand. Sitting there at that table, feeling the heavy weight of everyone's eyes on me, I could almost hear my heart urging me to speak up, to defend myself, to set the record straight so no one would walk away believing I was some cold, selfish parent. But something deeper inside told me to pause, to breathe, to resist the very human urge to fight back immediately. Because the truth is, sometimes reacting too quickly, especially in moments charged with emotion, only makes matters worse. It fans the flames, turning a spark of misunderstanding into a full-blown wildfire. I knew I had to be careful, not just for my own sake, but for hers as well. So instead of letting anger or hurt dictate my next move, I drew in a slow breath and steadied myself. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, beyond the carefully chosen words and theatrical sighs. I saw a young woman grappling with disappointment, clinging to an image of what her life was supposed to look like. Underneath her attempt to embarrass me, there was still that little girl who once ran into my arms after scraping her knee, trusting me to make everything better. And though this situation was infinitely more complex, that memory softened me enough to keep my composure. I smiled gently and simply said, "I'm sure whatever kind of wedding you choose to have will be beautiful, because it's about the two of you and your future together." That was all. No bitterness, no biting remarks, just a quiet statement of faith in what truly mattered. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't loaded with judgment or discomfort. It was contemplative, as if people around the table were reconsidering what they had just heard and perhaps seeing things in a slightly new light. Inside, I was still hurting. Make no mistake, staying calm didn't mean I was immune to the sting of being publicly criticized by my own daughter. But I also knew that if I had lashed out or tried to shame her in return, It would have only confirmed the worst assumptions. By choosing not to match her drama with more drama, I held on to my dignity and perhaps even left a small crack in her narrative. People might later wonder why I hadn't defended myself more forcefully, why I hadn't countered her complaints with my own laundry list of sacrifices. Maybe some of them would even see my restraint as the clearest sign of love in the room. It wasn't just about appearances, though. It was about the long game, about modeling the kind of grace and patience I hoped my daughter might one day learn for herself. If she and her fiancé were ever faced with disappointments or disagreements, I wanted her to remember that maturity often means keeping your head when it would be so much easier to lose it. That love sometimes demands swallowing your pride, not because you're wrong, but because preserving the relationship, or at least preserving your own integrity, is worth more than winning. Fleeting argument. Driving home that night, I replayed the dinner in my mind over and over. I questioned if I should have spoken up more, if staying calm had actually made me look weak. But by the time I pulled into my driveway, I felt at peace. I knew that maintaining my composure wasn't weakness at all. It was quiet strength. It was a small but powerful choice to rise above hurt feelings and refuse to let a single evening's discomfort define years of love and sacrifice. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply not take the bait. Looking back on that dinner, I realized the most pivotal moment wasn't when my daughter tried to humiliate me. It was how I chose to respond when the opportunity finally came to turn the tables. Because life has a way of handing you unexpected chances to reveal the truth, to let character speak louder than any carefully crafted story. And sometimes it does so in the subtlest, most surprising ways. After that tense round of conversation where my daughter painted herself as the tragic victim of an unfeeling parent, there was an uneasy lull. People shuffled in their seats, glanced down at their plates, clearly not knowing how to proceed. Then the pastor, perhaps trying to change the mood or offer a gentle pivot, asked my daughter and her fiancé what kind of values they hoped to build their marriage on. It was such an innocent, well-meaning question, but it cracked open the perfect space for honesty to step in. My daughter, visibly flustered, gave a few vague answers about loyalty and fun experiences together. It all sounded nice but a bit hollow, lacking any true conviction. That is power, maybe out of courtesy, maybe hoping for a warmer turn in the conversation, and asked what I believed helped a marriage endure. I could feel every eye swing in my direction. Even my daughter stiffened, her fork pausing mid-air, probably bracing for me to either retreat into awkward silence or seize the chance to embarrass her in return. But I didn't want to embarrass her. I didn't want to win some petty point. I wanted, in that moment, to remind everyone, especially her, what real love and family actually looked like. So I took a steady breath, smiled gently at the pastor, and said, I think the strongest marriages, the strongest families, are built on shared understanding and mutual respect. It's about being able to say no when it's the right thing and still knowing that the love underneath never changes. It's about trust, sacrifice, and choosing each other every day, even when it's uncomfortable. I could see a few heads nodding slowly. The room relaxed just a touch. Then I added, almost as an afterthought, but knowing exactly what it would mean, that's why I've tried to teach my daughter that love isn't proven by lavish spending. It's proven by years of standing by someone's side, by putting their well-being ahead of temporary desires, even if it's hard. I hope she'll see that one day. There was a pause, a long, reflective one. My daughter looked down at her lap. The pastor smiled warmly and patted my hand. Her future mother-in-law let out a soft breath, as if the tension she'd been holding finally slipped away. In that quiet moment, I hadn't shamed my daughter, hadn't needed to list all the sacrifices or decisions that brought us to this point. I'd simply held up a mirror to what mattered most, and in doing so, gently, almost imperceptibly, reclaimed the story. And that, I think, was the real victory. Not some triumphant speech that put her in her place, not a dramatic revelation of facts to sway the audience, but a calm, steady assertion of truth that required no defense. I didn't need to argue. The reality of who I was and what I believed stood firm on its own. Sometimes turning the tables isn't about clever comebacks or public vindication. It's about standing so solidly in your own values that the weight of false impressions simply can't stick. In that moment, without fanfare or applause, I managed to remind everyone, most importantly my daughter, that love has never been measured by extravagance. It's measured by the quiet, enduring strength that holds steady, even when it's misunderstood. When all was said and done, and the dishes from that tense dinner had long been cleared away, I found myself sitting alone later that night, replaying everything that had happened. I thought about my daughter's hurt expression, her carefully chosen words meant to sting, and the silent weight of the people around that table who didn't know the full story. I'll admit it left me with a dull ache in my chest, the kind only a parent truly understands. Because even when your child is wrong, even when they're unfair, your love for them doesn't just switch off. If anything, it deepens into something more complicated, more tender, tinged with the sadness of seeing them stumble through lessons they're not ready to learn. Over the following weeks, I had plenty of time to reflect on what this whole situation really meant. It wasn't about weddings or money, not at its core. It was about something much bigger, about what we teach the people we love by the choices we make, even when those choices disappoint them. It was about the values I'd spent my whole life trying to instill in my daughter: gratitude, humility, respect for hard work, and above all, an understanding that love isn't proved by the size of bank withdrawal but by showing up, time and again, with honesty and care. I thought back to all the small ways love had been shown to me throughout my life. The quiet sacrifices my own parents made, how my mother wore the same worn coat winter after winter so I could have a new school uniform, how my father took on extra shifts so there'd be a little more under the Christmas tree. Those acts weren't flashy. No one applauded them, but they were profound, shaping me into someone who understood that real love often operates far from the spotlight. It's steady and patient, willing to forego immediate praise for the long view of what's truly best. That's the kind of love I've tried to give my daughter. And even though she couldn't see it right then, blinded by dreams of dazzling chandeliers and extravagant receptions, I have faith that someday she will. Maybe it will be years from now, when she's planning a birthday party for her own child and finds herself pausing over the budget. Maybe it'll be on a quiet evening when she and her husband are paying bills, and she realizes the power of financial security over fleeting showmanship. Whenever it happens, I hope she'll remember that her mother wasn't being cold or stingy, but was, in fact, trying to protect her from learning these lessons the hard way. I also hope that one day she'll come to see how important it is to honor the quiet integrity of a family that lives within its means, that finds joy not in outward displays but in the trust that comes from knowing your needs, and even many of your wants, are lovingly met, not borrowed against a future burden. Because weddings come and go, the flowers wilt, the music fades, the photographs gather dust. But the foundation of a marriage, built on mutual understanding and shared responsibility, is what truly lasts. And maybe that's the final gift I could give her in all of this: a living example of what it looks like to stand by your principles with grace, to say no not out of spite but out of deeper care, to love someone enough to risk their temporary anger, believing that someday they'll grasp the bigger picture. Because, at the end of the day, the greatest proof of love isn't how much you're willing to spend on a single night. It's how far you're willing to go to ensure that, for all the nights to come, the people you care for are safe, secure, and truly understood.